Welcome to this plenary session, number 4. In this session, we have 3 speakers who will start. The first one is Mr. Mahlubi Mabizela, and then the second one will be Professor Nokanyo Mzanga, and then the third one is Judge Albi Sachs. So their bios are provided on the program. I will now call upon Mr. Mahlubi Mabizela, who will give us more information about the language planning framework for public higher education. And Mr. Mabizela is a Chief Director in the Department of Higher Education and Training. I know I've been in several sessions with him where he presented the draft of this document. So we are quite excited that he's joined us this afternoon, and it will give us more clarity. Already I see there were questions already that are on the chat, which I will pose them after his presentation. Thank you very much for coming. We really appreciate it. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Prof. And thanks for the invitation to this colloquium. I will be sharing my screen, and because I've got a presentation to go through. Thanks again to the organizers for this. I think all the protocol has already been observed earlier on, and except to say that we really appreciate this opportunity as the department. Prof, this comes to us as the department at an opportune time when we are busy trying to put together an implementation plan of this document, of the policy, which of course we will be sharing with the sector, or at least in the finalization stages of it, we will be working together with the sector. So we see the policy really as the revised language policy framework more and not so much as the new policy, but we do understand the theme that runs through the colloquium of the new policy, because there are indeed new aspects within the policy, which I will be talking about later on in the presentation. This has been a vibrant start to this colloquium, and I hope I will live up to the very high bar that has been set by the first speakers. And thanks for that. Of course, it is certainly unsettling and intimidating, but we're here to provide you with what we have as the policy. Now, as the department, some of the speakers have already indicated the background we have in putting together this revision of the policy, and of course, the new aspects that are covered in it. So I will not necessarily repeat all of what has been said, except, of course, to make some emphasis on certain issues, which then got translated in the policy, in the final version of the policy. So the review of the 2002 language policy was initiated following the report of the Ministerial Committee on Transformation and Social Cohesion and Elimination of Discrimination in Public Higher Education Institutions. That's the title of that committee, very long, but then people got creative and shortened it and named it after the chair of that committee, Prof. Sudin, and as the Sudin report. It reported in November 2008 after the review it conducted on many aspects of our higher education system. And you will remember it was set up following a racial incident that took place in one of our universities. So in its report, the committee then said it found that students who are not first language speakers of English continue to face challenges in many of the institutions, It also found that the implementation approach to the parallel medium language policies that are in place in a number of historically Afrikaans medium institutions discriminated against Black students. The minister is therefore urged to initiate a broad review of the obstacles facing the implementation of effective language policies and practices. And then it also then recommended that the minister should request institutions to indicate as part of their institutional planning processes how they will be addressing these difficulties. So then following that, from 2008, 2 years later, or 4 years later, in 2012, the minister established the Ministerial Advisory Panel on the development of African languages in higher education, short for that, MAPALE, which among other responsibilities had to undertake literature review on the development of African languages in South Africa, with particular focus on higher education institutions, to review the existing language policy for higher education and its implementation, particularly in relation to the development of African languages at South African universities, and recommend how it can be improved. That is the policy. To conduct an investigation of obstacles presented by the current structure and operations of the publishing industry in development and usage of African languages, and suggest possible ways on how this area can be improved, and also to interact with the work of the Ministerial Task Team on the review of the funding formula for universities, as well as the Green Paper development process, which were both underway at the time, in order to ensure that these processes have adequately addressed the development of teaching, research, and general development of African languages. This interaction must consider the mainstreaming of African languages in budgets and academic activities on our universities. So I've gone through all those deliberately, because then we've got aspects of those that we are going to be presenting in this presentation today, but also where we feature later on in the program today and tomorrow. So the MAPALE Commission, or the task team, came up with the recommendations after it had conducted the study, and it recommended to that the strengthening and enforcement of implementation of the language policy, especially the development of indigenous African languages as mediums of instructions and as support to learning. And that it recommended that the department should monitor and evaluate language policy implementation, so as to address the issues that were found to be short by the previous reviews that were conducted on the implementation of the language policy. Institutions should collaborate regionally to develop a language or languages with high concentration in that region. And I think the previous speakers also have touched on this one, that research needs to be undertaken to explore and document strategies for intellectualizing African languages for use in higher education. I'm just picking up the main issues, but otherwise the detail of that, suggestion is on the left-hand side. And of course, I'm sure you have been interacting with the policy. And that one of the recommendations also, that funding into research and development of indigenous African languages needs to be increased. A national study that would provide empirical evidence on the evolution of African language departments in South Africa to be conducted. And of course, with the aim of enhancing their effectiveness at the institutions, but also in the development of the languages. And to set up a dynamic partnership between the DBE, Department of Basic Education, and the DHET in order to establish an all-inclusive and participatory exchange between the two ministries. But also it goes beyond that to suggest that partnership, including other government departments and entities that are responsible for our languages. For example, PANSALP, the Department of Arts and Culture, to be part of those departments that the Department of Higher Education would be working with. And that the DHET should support funding initiatives around terminology planning in higher education, something that we are already doing to some extent, but also as part of the implementation of the language policy is one of the aspects that we'll be touching upon. And so in the process of development, or even at that stage, in fact, in 2016, we're finalizing the draft document. In fact, it was ready for, it had been signed off for publication, for public comment by December 2016. And that the South African Human Rights Commission, a Chapter 9 institution, published its Transformation at Public Universities report in December 2016 and requested institutions to submit their responses by December the following year. So in its study, the Commission sought to determine progress of transformation at the universities, and among its identification of factors that have contributed to the slow progress in transformation, it found that, that there was lack of commitment to multilingualism in institutions of higher learning, as well as lack of real commitment to the development of indigenous languages. As such, it recommended that universities review their current policies to determine appropriateness, practicality, and impact on the university culture, and that the department, in collaboration with the Transformation Oversight Committee and other relevant stakeholders, must conduct an assessment of impact of language policies on institutional culture and social integration, and must draft guidelines or best practices to assist universities in implementing language policies in a manner that promotes integration and access. So we've got to, or we had to consider all these, and as well as still continue considering them in the implementation of the policy. And of course, all the other developments that have been taking place, considering them. So now I'm coming to the nub of the new issues, basically, that the policy seeks to or has come up with in trying to make a difference from the previous implementation of the old language policy, if I can use that that terminology. So the revised language policy framework, it says that all institutions must develop strategies, policies, and implementation plans for promoting multilingualism, something that had not been there in previously. And so that in the implementation of this policy, therefore, the institutions individually have got to also develop their own strategies and plans for the implementation of the policy. And that is something that we will be working together with the institutions, but there's no reason that the institutions would be waiting for the department in order to develop those implementation plans. We are, as the department, also developing our own or a national implementation plan or strategy for the implementation of this policy. And that it commits to the development and study of all official South African languages, especially those which were historically marginalized, including the Khoi, Nama, and San languages. And again, this is something that has been cited already by the previous speakers, but this is also the second the second new intervention that the new policy or the revised policy is coming up with into the sector. And so therefore, in order to enable its implementation, its successful implementation, the policy makes several suggestions or injunctions to the sector. It says institutional language policy and plans or institutions must develop or revise their language policies and plans to accord greater importance to indigenous African languages for purposes of teaching and learning, scholarship, communication, and administrative use. the policies and plans must indicate strategies that the universities will adopt to promote multilingualism. So in the implementation plans of the institutions, those would be some of the aspects that will be looked at on whether the institutions have got them, and that is the indication of strategies that the universities will adopt in order to promote multilingualism. And of course, what I would want to view as the fine print, but not in a bad way, that the plans are to be submitted to the department. That's what the policy says. And the institutions are to report annually to the department on progress made in implementing their language policies and language development. So as the reviews that were done in the past have already indicated, and in fact, even the previous speakers had indicated that the previous policy or the old policy was not as successful as anticipated. So this is the intervention that this policy, the revised policy, is coming up with, such that then there is monitoring of its implementation at institutional level, and of course, with the department doing this at the sector level or national level. And then secondly, that institutions are strongly encouraged to foster a trans-institutional and inter-institutional collaborations in the development and strengthening of official South African or African languages. This again is not to look inwardly in terms of the institutions, but the impact that the higher education sector has got in society or in the communities around. And therefore, this is the intention that the higher education institutions have got to have an impact in their communities, and especially in the development of the African languages. And that thirdly, the creation of a receptive institutional culture which embraces linguistic diversity and promotion of a climate where people feel affirmed and empowered to realize their full potential must be supported. And again, the previous speakers have spoken extensively on this matter. The institutions must establish or strengthen, if existing, centers for language development to undertake relevant research required with respect to each of the official languages. And I guess that is self-explanatory. Institutions are strongly encouraged to develop regional partnerships and collaborative language development programs with other universities and language bodies to avoid working in silos. This will assist in the sharing of information and data relating to language and terminology development for various disciplines. And of course, language, as people always say, is not static, and therefore it develops. So the institutions are then enjoined to develop terminology or new terminologies in these languages, especially in the regions. But of course, this will have a national impact. Just finally, to say that in the implementation of this policy, or even in the development of it, we have been following what is happening and still follow what is happening in the sector. For example, in relation to the legal challenges that are often posed at various institutions. And we factor that we had done so in the development of the policy. We had factored it so that we are able to address the issues that some of these legal challenges had brought up. And of course, the judgments, which are more important. There was a constitutional judgment in 2017 that we studied closely in the development of the policy. And of course, another challenge which has been raised earlier on is the challenge of funding, because all of this has got to be done with funding. It can't just be done, or we expect it to be successful without any funding. And the policy itself, requires the institutions to invest in the development of the African languages. But the department is also doing its bit, and Dr. Lewin will talk a little bit more about that in her session tomorrow. And of course, the capacity issues and the collaboration with the entities and other departments seeks also to address the issue of capacity, but also making sure that we are not operating as silos, either as entities, PANSAL, for example, or NIHSS, or other government departments, arts and culture, in this case, Department of Science and Innovation, with the National Research Foundation as one of the entities. So we seek to put together all these entities and other government departments so that there is coordination in the effort of development of the African languages. Thank you very much, Chair. That is all I have to say for now. And I hope that it has addressed the issues that were expected that I would be addressing in this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mabizela, for such a very informative presentation. I think this is very helpful because this gives us a bit of a background on what the new policy framework is all about. I'm quite happy that you clarify, because there was already a question of whether is this a new policy framework, or is it really a revision of the previous one? So I think you made it very clear that it's not a new policy framework, but it's just a revision of the previous policy framework. And I think it's also important that we distinguish between a policy framework and a policy. This is not a language policy; it's a language policy framework. But policies will be developed by the universities. So I think it is very, very important to make that distinction. So there are a few questions that have already been forwarded, but we are not going to take questions at this moment. We are going to take all the questions during the time of discussion. That is when we will have, now I will again raise this question, but in the meantime, you can continue posting your questions. I'm taking note of them. We will raise them during discussion time. We're going to have 20 minutes of discussion, and that will provide us enough time to deal with some of the issues that we have raised. So we are expecting the next speaker, I think for this session, was supposed to start at half past 2, Professor Mzanga. But I think seeing that we have a bit of time, getting to her, so maybe while she's preparing, I will also just making some comments on what people have really raised here. I think there were some people also who really wanted to understand the plan that Mr. Mabizela has indicated, the plan from the department. So maybe while waiting for the question time, Mr. Mabizela can start thinking, about maybe a bit about that, the national plan that will be developed, and maybe indicate when will that plan be publicized or be published, because I think it will really give us a very good direction to the speaker. So I think I can say Professor Mzanga is ready. So I will really hand over to her. Professor Mzanga, their bio is there on the program. She is currently the Deputy Dean at the Nelson Mandela University, and she's also Vice Chair of the Committee of Practice. So I think I will just hand over to her, then she can start her presentation. Over to you, Professor Mzanga.
Thank you, Prof. Madiba. Can you see my slide?
Yeah, I can see it. Yeah, I can see it, yeah.
I'm not sure whether my video is on or not, because I can't see myself.
Your video is on, we can see you. And we can see your presentation. Yeah, okay.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you, Chair. Molweni, good afternoon, colleagues. Dumelang, Ache, goeiemiddag. Thank you so much for this opportunity to share my thoughts in the colloquium. Last week I attended, I'm trying to get this thing to move, but it doesn't seem to move. So last week I attended a symposium, the Higher Education Disabilities South Africa Symposium, and the theme in that symposium was, what is there that we do not see? As much as my presentation was focusing on the invisible disabilities that we have in our higher education institutions, I realized that actually the same question can be asked when it comes to issues of language policy. Mr. Mabizela has already alluded to the legislative frameworks and the ministerial reports that argue for the promotion of multilingualism, which embraces the development of African indigenous languages as academic languages in higher education institutions. And we notice that what all these policies or frameworks actually have in common is the fact that they recognize that language is essential in facilitating the communication of knowledge in a learning process. At the same time, you notice that the whole issue is about ensuring that the two languages, which is English and Afrikaans, which are currently the languages of learning and teaching in our institutions, do not act as barrier, to opportunity, access, and success for those who speak them as additional languages. But however, it seems as if we are taking too long to see what is there. Because when I was reflecting on this question, what is there that we do not see? I then realized that actually, it seems as if we do not see the value of knowledge embedded in African languages, the richness of a multilingual academic space, and the value of languages as an expression of identity, culture, and heritage of its speakers. In my view, success begins the moment you see yourself in an environment. For instance, in this particular case, if we all agree that, like as Prof. De Villiers said, that our institutions of higher learning are a reflection of diversity, then the question is, do we then see and value what we have? Because if we're talking of that diversity, it means there are students, who are bringing with them diverse knowledges, diverse languages, and so forth. But then I thought that it's going to be important for us as well in this colloquium to maybe go a little bit backward and we start looking at our institutions. I mean, generally what we already know is that there is an increasing rise of enrollment numbers. And most of the students these days, including African students, they have access to higher education, and mostly because of the funding that is there. At the same time, we recognize the transition challenges. For instance, one of those challenges is the fact that when students come to the university, they are coming from a system that was promoting English only, and they come to a system that seeks to promote multilingualism. So for me, there is a disconnect there between, all these conversations that are taking place in higher education institutions and the conversations that are taking place in basic education. So I think it's very important as we are thinking about questions of access and success. Of course, universities at the moment, they do provide transition support strategies. And even at that, you realize that some of these support strategies are on their own, barriers because they are provided in a language that students don't all have access to. That is, the nuances of that language seems to be a barrier on its own. And of course, we know, and there's a lot of research around the fact that one of the major challenges in our institutions is the whole issue around academic writing. And of course, universities have put in place support strategies in that regard. And yes, there is support for student success, because you can see that what is currently happening, there are tutorials and the learning material is translated into various languages and so forth. And at the same time, we notice that there is a high dropout rate, and low participation rate, especially among students who are not first language speakers of English. And this is always evident in the graduation throughput rates. And amidst all of that, of course, are funding and accommodation issues. So for me, I think it is important that we understand, what is happening in our higher education institutions and try to link that to the imperatives that we want to achieve, as informed by the revised language policy framework. Because the main question for me is the who question. Who is the student in our public higher education institutions? And how is this student impacted by all of these factors that I've mentioned earlier? And why is this student impacted? I know that we do have assumptions with regard to these questions, but at the same time, we must take note that students bring with them, what is it that they bring in terms of their linguistic capital? What is it that they bring in terms of, their social or cultural capital? And how do they differ in terms of these issues? And what is the major issue for those who are learning in a second language? Because as you can see from this slide, literature does acknowledge the complex set of personal language and academic learning skills for all students. And at the same time, it takes into consideration that some students have a social capital, already they are not first generation students in higher education institutions. And of course, one of the issues is around academic writing, which is very complex, especially, to second language students, because they have to deal with writing skills and the writing culture of the institution. Right. So if we agree in this colloquium, as Prof. de Villiers mentioned earlier, that South Africa is a linguistically and culturally diverse society, surely we will also agree that language plays a significant role in students' access and success in higher education institutions. And if you look at the revised new language framework, basically, I think the previous speakers have already alluded to what this is all about. But then you notice that it seeks to achieve a number of important imperatives. And I like the fact that what is in the framework is regarded as an imperative. And I think also Mr. Mabizela did mention, the fact that at this point in time, we all need to work towards strengthening and enforcing, implementation. And it's always interesting that, to look at what this framework actually says, and it does recognize, first of all, that indigenous languages have been neglected in the past. But then we are not just talking about the 2020 framework. If you look at the language policy of 2002, it also was trying to address this issue. And what it means is 19 years into this process, the revised policy, it still says that it is necessary now that these languages are developed and utilized. But the question is, was that not the plan all along? And if you look at these imperatives, also there's a mention that multilingualism in general should be recognized and promoted as an integral part of a South African reality, and that all languages in use in South Africa should be respected, and valued. But obviously, if this was the situation, let's say from 2002, because this framework is a review of the 2002 language policy for higher education, surely we still have challenges in our institution. And I hope that this colloquium will be able to respond to these questions. What are the dynamics and complexities then surrounding the development of African languages and promotion of multilingualism in higher education institutions? Because I want to believe that if we look at the 2002 policy, it used a lot of non-committal, phrases, that is, where reasonable possible, if it is possible, and so forth. And I think it's also very important for us to examine the language that is used in this policy framework, because that's what is going to guide us, in implementing or in designing an implementation plan in 2021. So given the fact that we are still in the process of negotiation, of understanding, of debating, these changes which concern multilingualism and the development of African indigenous languages, so surely there are complexities around it. So what are those complexities? Because I believe that if we are really looking forward to having an inclusive or a multilingual language policy, then we also need to address all of these barriers, that are standing in our way. And secondly, I think we also need to answer the question, how do higher education institutions plan to establish a multilingual teaching, learning, and research environment which considers indigenous African languages as enablers to students' access and success? Yes, I do acknowledge that some universities have done, pockets of research on the implementation of multilingual strategies, such as translanguaging, multilingual glossaries, and so forth for students' access and success. And it was not only about research, because there is evidence in literature that those strategies have been applied in teaching and learning practices, and they seem to be working. But the question is, what is it then that we find ourselves still, debating this whole issue when we have research that provides evidence that in a multilingual learning and teaching space, there are benefits and students do, benefit from that. So as we continue then, to grapple with all of this, I think also we need to look at the question of access from various viewpoints. Yes, we are talking of access to epistemic, access or access to knowledge. But I think we also need to talk about access to resources and learning opportunities. We also need to talk about access to policies, access to instructions, access to research, access to conversations, access to signages, access to enrollment and participation, access to academic support, access to the internet, the online learning, access to public life. So as we are debating this whole notion of access, I would want us to also take into consideration that if we are looking at a university, for instance, Prof. Bauer earlier mentioned or questioned the place of our universities in our society. Now, if we are thinking of having multilingualism as one of our graduate attributes, then we should start thinking about access. What happens when our students, join the society? What happens when they become pharmacists? Are they still going to be functioning in a way that serves the community or society when the only language that they can use, it's English, for instance? How do we then think of access? And what happens actually in our own institutions when we want to converse with other colleagues and only realizing that the barrier, even within the institution, is the barrier of language, because we are not in a position where we can tap on the richness of our languages to even communicate with each other. I'm not even talking about, a learning and a teaching space. I'm talking about us as a community in an institution. I think I've already alluded to the academic support, because we also need to think about how this support is provided. Is it still provided in a language that is a barrier to some of the students? Then if that is the case, what is it that we want to achieve? And right now, our students are learning online. And what is the language of the internet? Are students able to tap into the African languages on the internet? And what challenges then are they experiencing in that regard? So what it means then, as we're thinking about, designing these policies, being guided by the revised language policy, and we're thinking in terms of access and success, as we grapple with all of these complexities, I think it would be important for us to not only focus on knowledge, but also to think of success broadly. Of course, the journey might be long, but I think we have started the journey, and, it can be done as long as there is will. And I think that is the purpose of us having this two-day conversation with the relevant people, because this, I think in one of the conversations where Dr. Mabizela addressed us at COPAL, what he raised at the time was the question of leadership in terms of how, our institutions can take leadership to ensuring that this journey doesn't take another 19 years for us to actually do something about it. And at this point, I just want to reflect on what we do in my institution, which is the Nelson Mandela University. We also started this revised language policy process in 2018. And I want to believe that the language working group is here in this colloquium. And I think the point of departure was for us to identify, what was troubling in the current language policy of the institution. And what became so obvious was the fact that I think one of our colleagues, Chantal van der Merwe, refers to this as the English default, where we realize that the predominant language in our current language policy, it was actually English as the predominant language of tuition and assessment. So I think that was our first point of departure. And at the time, the then DVC Learning and Teaching, convened a meeting with the language working group, which is the academic experts, students, and any other person who wanted to be part of that. And in our discussions then, we thought, if we're thinking of developing a language policy, then we need to have an inclusive approach. And that was informed actually by the framework itself, which speaks about, I'm going to read it, it speaks about promoting multilingualism as a strategy to facilitate meaningful access and participation by university communities. And that included, the staff members as well, because we thought that if we're talking of a language policy, then it has to be an institutional issue. It cannot just be about students. Hence, our approach was more inclusive, and we decided to have courageous conversations with, past staff, everybody, cleaners, administrators, faculties, student groups, because we really wanted that our language policy addresses all aspects of the institution. And these are the prompts that we used as we engaged with the university community. What are your language experiences at Nelson Mandela University? And how do you envisage a multilingual, inclusive institutional culture at Nelson Mandela University? Like I said, for us, the issue of access and success will take everybody who is in the institution. Hence, we had to involve everyone else. And then there were also small groups discussions where we asked the questions like, what institutional arrangements do we begin to think about? Because we felt that as much as Mr. Mabizela did mention funding as one of the challenges, we wanted to think beyond funding. And hence we suggested that, in our discussion, let's not let money stop our thinking. Let's go beyond and think of possible practical ideas. And then the other question was, what are the bigger questions that we need to ask ourselves? The sector, how do we change our thinking? Because we realize that actually there is research that also says that even the African students themselves, are comfortable in being part of the English default, because as it is now, I think I did mention that even in the basic education, English is promoted as the language of learning and teaching. And if you examine, their educational trajectories, you find that even in our communities, English, or if you can speak English, then you are regarded as somebody who is very intelligent, and which is not true, of course. So we wanted, ways in which our thinking can change and be able to recognize the role of African languages. And then we thought that, maybe the university community is also thinking of other people that can be part of the conversation. Hence, we asked that question, and what must happen in order for the language or communication journey to be a success and most inclusive? So as I said, basically the whole point was we did not want to have a language policy that will be drafted only by the academics or language aspect, because we realize that it actually goes beyond that. Hence, I mentioned earlier that for us, this is an institutional issue. And we are happy that we have vice chancellors in this colloquium, the ones that are in leadership, will be able to do this. At the same time, as mentioned by Prof. Madiba, I am the deputy chair of COPAL and a member of COPAL, that is the community of practice for the teaching and learning of African languages. And I think Prof. Kumalo did mention that as COPAL, we do encourage the members to actually, take leadership in the revised policy developments in higher education institutions. And what we also encourage are ongoing debates on multilingualism and development of indigenous African languages as languages of academia. And we recognize that just like this revised policy, maybe it's time now that we shift from policy on paper, but to implementation. But at the same time, we are aware that some of the institutions still need to be able to, to understand what this language policy framework actually means in practice and to deal with the complexities and the dynamics around it. Hence those two questions that are posed earlier on. And as COPAL, we do support the views that the value of language is created. I think Neville Alexander did mention that this is not a given. It has to be created, especially that our history has really marginalized the African languages. What it means then that there is still work that to be done so that these languages are recognized as having value in the scholarship of learning and teaching, research, community engagement, and so forth. We also support the view that promotes communication competence in indigenous languages and encourage labor market to make such competence an imperative. I think I did mention earlier on that we also believe that one of the graduate attributes should be multilingualism. In closing, I just want to quote what is mentioned there in the report on the use of African languages as mediums of instruction in higher education, which I think we really need to, to think about. It says that disregard for African languages in higher education manifests itself particularly in the throughputs of students speaking languages other than English, which is low compared to the numbers of students who gain access in higher education. Because really we need to ask ourselves, given the number of enrollments that we have, especially from students who speak other languages, who speak African languages, what happens, throughout their university life? And then we think about that in terms of the languages that we use as languages of learning and teaching. At the same time, I think we should all be encouraged by what is in the language policy framework, which states that all institutions must develop strategies, policies, and implementation plans for promoting multilingualism as defined by this policy framework. Such plans must indicate at least 2 official languages other than the medium of instruction or language of teaching and learning, which in most cases is English or Afrikaans, for development for scholarly discourse, as well as official communication. And I want to repeat the question, what is there that we do not see? And what will it take for us to see the value of knowledge embedded in African languages, the richness of a multilingual academic space, and the value of languages as an expression of identity, culture, and heritage of its speakers? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Mzanga, for your presentation. It has given us a lot of information, a lot of food for thought. So I think there are a few questions, definitely that will come back to you, and you will be able to explain some of the things during question and answer time. So this, I think, now takes us to the next speaker. We still have 5 minutes, but if the next speaker is ready, then we can really cross over. So our next speaker is Judge Albie Sachs, who is a retired judge of the South African Constitutional Court. It's a full bio is provided on the program there. I mean, he's well known. I mean, he's really described as an activist besides just being a former judge. I've also met him in several platforms. He has been very vocal about the language issue in South Africa, and he has presented, many presentations. And today, I think we are so fortunate to have him in our midst, so that he's able to give us the legal perspectives, the constitutional issue, which I think recently you will agree with me, colleagues, that there have been in several cases that have gone even up to the Constitutional Court. And some of us who are language scholars, we are really we're learning quite a lot from the process, but it's really important to get someone who has been there, who understands not just been there, but who've been part of the drafting of the Constitution and all the other negotiations that have taken place. So without much ado, I will hand over to Judge Albisex to give us the perspective from the Constitution. Over to you, Judge Albisex.
Hello there. Can you see me? Can you hear me?
We can hear you, but yeah, I think the camera, if you want us to see, maybe if you press the camera, we can see you. It looks like the camera is off. Yeah, if you just press on that camera picture there, maybe then you can come up. Yeah.
I'm trying.
But I can see your presentation is there.
Yes. Vanessa? I want you all to see my nice smiling face. Just give me,
Judge.
yeah. Just give me one minute.
Yes, yeah. I think it's just pressing the camera there. It will open up for you. Yes, yeah. Then we can see you.
Vanessa.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, I hope that help will come in a minute. I've been trying to get my camera on, but okay. I'd like to take you back imaginatively. I'm now Judge Albie, or I was then Judge Albie. If you can help me get the image.
Oh yeah, thanks so much for correcting me on that. Yeah.
Is it your turn now to speak publicly?
I'm speaking.
Okay, can't get you. We'd have to sign you out and sign you in again. Sorry.
Yeah, I think it just needs to play the camera on.
Ask him to give you a minute. You can speak in the meantime, and I'll sign up. You can speak in the meantime. Yes. I'll set up another computer for you.
Okay.
In the meantime.
So I'm trying to take you back and imagine now. We're in the first temporary accommodation of the Constitutional Court. Tiny room, jam-packed, and you could feel the emotion in that room. The issue was the Gauteng Language Education Bill had been referred to us. These days it's very rare for the provinces to pass laws. In those days we thought there'd be plenty. One of the very first laws passed was by the Gauteng legislature, and it was called the Language Bill. And its main provision, as far as we were concerned, was to say that language should not be used as a barrier for entry into the schools. And this was now being challenged by Afrikaans-speaking community language groups that were saying that for the Afrikaans language to thrive and survive, we need immersion in schools that are centered around people living in the Afrikaans community speaking Afrikaans. And I remember we heard the argument, and I remember the anguish and the passion of one of the council for the Afrikaans language groups. And in a strange way, I identified with him indirectly. It reminded me of the apartheid days when I was appearing in court with anti-apartheid beliefs, but having to deal with judges appointed by the apartheid government, laws that overtly expressed apartheid. The whole ambience was racist. And this counsel, this advocate, was feeling he's in a setting, he probably would have called it liberal, individual rights, that has no sensitivity towards responsiveness towards community languages and what it means. And his anguish was that if he failed in his argument, his Nasi, his nation, his people would suffer. And I took myself back to the days when I was so afraid fearful as an advocate, feeling that could be my comrades, it could be people from other political organizations, that they would possibly lose their lives, they'd go to jail, that kind of anguish. So when the case was handed to Ismail Mohammed, who was deputy president of the court, to deal with, he dealt with it very, very quickly. He was a very swift, fast writer and thinker, brilliant thinker. And the text of the Constitution seemed to be quite clear. In terms of education, you could set up your own schools, your own institutions, you paid for them, you got support from government, and they could be single language, they could be a single religion, but not racist. And as far as public schools were concerned, the general principles of non-racism applied. There should be open access, and there was no such privilege given, as he saw it, to monolingual schools based on that basis. So he dashed off his judgment, sent it around, and I kind of put up my hand and I said, no, I wanted to write a judgment agreeing with his outcome, but arriving there by a different route. And at that stage, he was in a hurry, and I was eager to deal with the minority rights dimension of the whole issue. In London, when I'd been in exile, I'd had done a lot of work with the minority rights group that supported the anti-apartheid struggle. And I came to the conclusion in South Africa, the minority behaved like a majority. The majority were treated like the minority in terms of language, access to franchise, access to land, access to all the things that mattered. That inverted the normal majority-minority relationship. And now we're in South Africa where the majority are passing the laws. The minority is hugely privileged because of the racism of the past. How do you reconcile those two themes? And I took the minority rights angle very, very seriously. It was growing in dimensions internationally, and it was something that we needed on the agenda in South Africa to face up to very, very clearly. And in the concurring judgment that I wrote, I stressed the fact that if Afrikaans medium schools were now trying to survive as Afrikaans medium schools, we had to see the background. And part of the background was the policy of the British after the Anglo-Boer War to suppress Afrikaans, to anglicize Afrikaans-speaking people. So there was active suppression of Afrikaans and marginalization. That was one. But I also said we must take account of the fact Afrikaans language is spoken by millions of South Africans from all backgrounds, rich farmers, poor working class people, homeless people, and people with more than one home. It's a Creole language, very, very South African in character, and it produced some great literature, important work in law, in science, in radio, in song. It was one of the treasures of South African cultural expression. It was important to remember that, and a treasure to be treasured, to be maintained. On the other hand, there were Black children living close to those schools. The schools were over-resourced in schooling terms. They had half-empty classrooms. They had Bunsen burners. They had libraries. They had everything. And Black kids were clamoring to get access to education. They might have been a few of the emerging Black middle class. It might have been the children of the domestic workers, of the cleaners. It could have been children from a wide variety of backgrounds, and they had a right to education, and a strong right to education that was absolutely urgent. So it seemed to me to have half-empty schools vacant simply because of wanting to maintain monolingualism in the long run wouldn't protect that language. It would make that language look beleaguered, exclusionary, and on balance, the Gauteng Education Bill had to be supported. It didn't mean suppression of Afrikaans. It meant those schools had to cater, certainly with their excess seating and accommodation and teaching capacities, find a way to cater for the kids who didn't speak Afrikaans, who were English speaking or Sotho speaking or Zulu speaking, find a place for them. So that expressed if you like, my judicial approach to the whole matter. And I think it's tensions like these with another tension that was mentioned by the previous speaker. When it came to drafting our language clauses in the Constitution, it was another very intense moment at the World Trade Center. I think there were 3 of us on the ANC side, or 2 of us, Baleka Mbeti, Cecilia, myself, and there was a huge array of professors, language specialists, Neil Barnard on the side of the South African government. And I think they were thinking this is a crisis moment. The whole constitutional project will collapse if the Afrikaans language is going to go under. And I think they were rather amazed when Baleka and I came up with what was then ANC policy. And that was not to diminish the existing official languages, which was English and Afrikaans, and then in some of the Bantustans, it would be the African language, but to upgrade and advance the African languages. So it wasn't a question of domination and suppression and new kinds of domination. The key thing was to upgrade and advance the utilization and significance of the African languages. And lo and behold, we got that language clause through relatively quickly. Another proposal I made was to have a pan-South African language board to foster multilingualism. And the board was not to be created by representatives of different languages fighting each in their own corner for their language. It was to have a multilingual philosophy and approach from the beginning. I wish the board somehow could have been given more resources and more space to be proactive in dealing with many of the issues that come up before the courts. Nevertheless, their role has been significant, has been useful, and hopefully will become even more useful in future. Looking back now, when it came to universities, I remember giving a presentation in would have been the middle 1990s, language for higher education, envisaging a multilingualism, English being used probably universally as a medium of instruction, and that shouldn't be seen English as a form of exclusion and oppression. I found in countries like Denmark, the Netherlands, and so on, the language is protected because they are so fluent in English for international commerce, for trade, for travel, and so on. Then they have space to nurture Hollands, Dutch, Netherlands in their own country, and very rich cultural expressions, a lively form of Dutch, if you like, personality coming through. So that could be what would be something that would be universal in the universities in South Africa, but there would be a strong emphasis, I thought, of regional languages, fostering indigenous languages. If I can call Afrikaans indigenous, it's become indigenous to the Cape, with a very special interest in that. And it could be Fort Hare, focusing very much on the Eastern Cape, history, culture, geography, and Xhosa language, University of Zululand also having a special kind of developmental interest in developing isiZulu. It hasn't quite worked out that way. And I think that tension between enabling a minority language that feels threatened to flourish and develop versus the need for open entry, that tension has affected every single university in our country. It's been pronounced in Stellenbosch, it's been pronounced in the Free State, and recently it's arisen in relation to UNISA. And I think what we're seeing now from the court, with what appeared to be a strong access-oriented decision in relation to the Free State university language policy, on the one hand.
Can you pause for a second? Please, can you pause for a second?
Yes.
Transferring you.
Can you see my smile?
Just a minute, Albie.
Yes, now we can see you very well now, Judge.
Okay.
Now we can see your shirt.
Okay, so I'm just entering that last lap of my race.
No, thanks so much. We can see you. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So I was saying that the decision in the Free State case, it clearly created strong thinking on the part of the judges in the Constitutional Court. And the emphasis there seemed to, where the shoe seemed to pinch the most, was in terms of access and a sense of comfort at the university. In the recent decision on UNISA, the emphasis was very much on the practicalities. Do something about it, this multilingualism aspect, and allow people who are Afrikaans sprekende people who are comfortable in the Afrikaans language to also feel comfortable there. So I don't think the court has any fixed position. I think the facts become very important in each case. I think that tension has to always be acknowledged, and which way the decision will go will then be very dependent on the factual practical situation. My own hope is, and my own expectation is, that Afrikaans is far less threatened than some of its defenders feel in terms of the lack of what they see as constitutional protection. The real protection of Afrikaans comes from the fact it's a very lively language. There's a relatively wealthy community speaking Afrikaans who can support newspapers and theatre and films and quite a strong culture. That's the real protection of the Afrikaans language. The fact that it's lively in society. And where the Constitution comes in is to defend its right to of expression, the space for expression, the freedom to speak and use Afrikaans in these multifaceted ways. What's sorely needed is for the African languages to go through the transition that the Afrikaans supporters pioneered for Afrikaans in the 1930s, the 1940s, 1950s, and 60s with concerted efforts to ensure, I remember the first legal textbook in Afrikaans, 1946, by L.C. Steyn, and it was greeted with jubilation as a kind of a breakthrough. And we look forward to the first textbooks in the African languages. It's more than breakthroughs, and the support from the speakers of that language, but also from the Pan-South African Language Board, from the whole community. We all benefit from a multiplicity of faiths, of political positions, and multiplicity of languages. And I'm sure that this conference, that seems to have a very widespread and to be very, very thoughtful and not to be polemical, but searching for ways forward, will make a significant contribution to achieving that at the level of higher education. So I'll just wave goodbye to you now and wish the conference every success. And I believe I should be available for Q&A a little later.
Yes, Judge, I think we will now go to the question and answer. So maybe you can just stay on. I hope the other speakers will come and join in. Then we can take questions. Yeah, I think yes. Thank you very much, Judge, for this very insightful presentation. It's very fascinating to see how sometimes when you see a text written, we just see a document written, the Constitution, but sometimes we don't understand what went into that document, what kind of negotiations, what was compromised, what was agreed upon. I think it's very, very fascinating to see how organizations like PENSAP came to be, what was the thinking behind that, some of the clauses, what we're thinking behind that. So I think you've really given us a very good overview. So I will ask, I think the other speakers should join us so that we can take questions. So I've already have a clear set of questions that has been forwarded to me, but maybe while waiting for the others to take questions, I should really pose this question to you because it's you have touched on it. It comes from one journalist from Netwerk, where it says, should Afrikaans be included in the definition of indigenous languages of our country? Why, or if not, why not? So you have just mentioned, I think, something touch on that aspect. So maybe it's something that really needs further elaboration, because it's a big issue. If we look at the current language policy framework, it gives a definition of what is regarded as an indigenous language. And in that definition, Afrikaans does not really seem to belong there because it says that this is a language that should have been previously classified as a Bantu language. So in that definition, in this framework, Afrikaans does not seem to fall under to be regarded as qualify as an indigenous language. So maybe you can take us through it while others will be waiting for their questions.
A lot of my thinking came to me when I was in Mozambique in exile, and Samora Machel was very strong on everybody learning and using Portuguese, but also being very proud of their own languages. And I remember the Minister of Culture then saying, after 500 years, I think we can say Portuguese is an indigenous language. It's an African language. Because we in Frelimo, in the freedom struggle, were using Portuguese for our liberation. But I think we have to look at, and that's, by the way, where I and others developed the idea of not having a single language of national unity. That in principle, no language is worth more than any other language. There shouldn't be one official language. I've learned that in Mozambique. It was a mistake. Samora said, for the nation to live, the tribe must die. But it doesn't mean the languages must die. It means tribalism, which is separatist, must die. In the context of South Africa, it's quite clear Indigenous is used as a counterpoint to the official state languages of the apartheid era. And when we spoke about the official languages not being reduced or diminished, it was to protect Afrikaans. English doesn't need protection. English is like the air you breathe. All English speakers think it's not even a language. The language are those other things that people speak. So it was really to protect Afrikaans that we said non-diminution. But to upgrade, you don't upgrade Afrikaans in that sense. You develop Afrikaans, but you don't upgrade because it's been the beneficiary of huge state resources in all sorts of ways in the previous era. And by and large, there are many, many wealthy Afrikaans speakers with a great literature, TV programs, films. People argue about whether you like this singer or that singer or the other, but it's a very rich and developed language of cultural expression. So the point of having indigenous languages is not to emphasize the indigenous character, but to emphasize that they were subject to oppression in the past, to marginalization, exclusion, and that there has to be special investment, special backing, special support, so that they can flourish in the way that Afrikaans has flourished.
Okay, thank you very much, Judge, for that answer. Now, maybe I can pose a question to Mr. Mabizela. There have been questions regarding the status of this framework, whether it is, what is its status? Is it final? And then also, I think questions that I've already asked, whether it's a revision of the previous one. So maybe just clarify the status of Mr. Mabizela, the status of this framework. I can see Mr. Mabizela is typing. I'm not so sure if it's having some problem. Okay, okay. So he's struggling to unmute. Can someone unmute him? So if it's still preparing, maybe I can just ask this, because that question that I've asked of the definition, it was also supposed to, that we should pose to everyone. So I don't know if Professor Mzanga, you want to add something there while we're waiting for Mr. Mabizela. The question on Afrikaans as an indigenous language.
Prof, can you repeat that? Sorry, I missed it. I think I have an internet issue.
Yeah. No, the person who posed the question on Afrikaans as an indigenous language requested that each speaker must respond to that question. So I want to get your response to that. Should Afrikaans be included in the definition of indigenous languages of our country? If not, why or why not?
Okay, I think the question is debatable, actually, because on one hand, there's this definition that is mentioned in the language policy framework, as you have already alluded to. On the other hand, if we look at the history of the development of Afrikaans, you realize that Afrikaans was developed, here in South Africa. So what does it make Afrikaans to be? So hence I said, I think the question is very debatable. But at the same time, I do hear what the judge is saying in terms of, the fact that the language has been a beneficiary of status and everything else that has been mentioned. So I think for us, what needs to be clarified maybe is what is our operative definition of indigenous? What does the word indigenous mean? Then we will be able to answer the question. So I think the question is debatable. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm not so sure if Mr. Mabizela is able to unmute now, because that maybe you can give us a bit of a background, the thinking behind the exclusion of Afrikaans from that definition. It looks like Mr. Mabizela is still not able to unmute. Okay, if he unmute, then he will be able to, maybe you can just go back to that question and just give the response from the government side. So maybe in the meantime, let's just carry on with another question that I think will be, yeah, there's some, because most of the question here, how do we bring okay. Most of the questions that are here have to do with Mabizela, but maybe some of you will. The next question, of course, where does the policy put the sector of the Department of Basic Education? I know Mr. Mabizela has indicated that they are planning to collaborate with different departments, arts and culture, and so on. So I don't know if this is something that Professor Mzanga, you want to comment on that.
Prof, you might remember in one of our COPAL meetings, I think it was 2019, we asked that question because our concern was whether there is communication or a conversation between DBE and DHET around this question of language policy. And I remember even yourself in the comment that you put to the government, you know, this was one of the questions, because our concern was, it seems as if there is no conversation between the two, because currently you don't hear any revision of the language in education policy, the 1997 one. And on the other hand, we are revising the 2002 language policy for higher education. What does that mean? Does it mean that we are not having challenges in as far as DBE is concerned? So I think Mr. Babuzela will be in a better position to give clarity on whether they have that conversation and whether where this policy puts the sector of DBE. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I think really it's a question that if we don't get good integration, there's someone who put a comment here that the policy framework, it seems to be a very positive thing, but it looks like we are working in silos. If universities work in silos, and I think also if departments work in silos, there might be problems. For example, I mean, I think this issue of basic education language policies, some of the things that we are teaching, for example, language acquisition in higher education, those things could have been taught if each learner has to learn at least an indigenous language at primary level. We wouldn't really be doing that when it comes to university. So I think that's I think this was the thinking behind this question. And then there's another question that say the central to the use of indigenous languages as a medium of instruction in the development of discipline-related jargon. Who will be responsible for this task? I think that has to do with the intellectualization of African languages. So again, maybe Prof. Samzano, you can take it, and well, I think we can also get some insight from the judge.
Let's hear the judge first.
I'm used to asking the questions, not giving the answers. You know, I don't think it's everybody's waiting for someone else, and it should be just the other way around. Everybody should be acting. So the people in the community, the speakers of the African languages, should be mobilizing at a community level. Business people, professionals, and others, not in the apartheid separate way, you know, tribalistic and inward-looking, in a proud way, as South Africans, contributing something to the richness of everything. So they should be active in that. We want to see newspapers. We already have a lot of radio, some TV. I think quite a lot's been done in those areas of encouraging multilingualism. But then you need educationists working on the job. And clearly, Department of Education has to be very involved. And maybe that's, I think the last speaker before me was saying we've got to move from policy to operations. And now it's now, maybe you have to have a policy on operations. You can carry on forever having policies, but on the institutional mechanisms necessary. And maybe you start with some pilots. Don't try and do the whole thing all at once, then you end up with nothing. Try out some teaching at some levels. I believe very strongly much more should be done at the schools, and something proactive at each university in terms of inviting, creating space, maybe using some existing posts, but giving them a denomination that's related to language development. It needs a lot of creativity in that way. But if everybody's waiting for everybody else, then nothing will happen. So I think the speaker, the person who posed the question, should be the first one to start.
Yeah. No, look, I think the point that you've mentioned, Judge, is of Afrikaans, that the first book written, you know, for texts for law in the 1940s, But you see, that raises a question. There is always a reference that look at the miracle of Afrikaans, how Afrikaans from a kitchen language, how it developed to become a language that was used across higher levels. But some critics will argue that it looks like the Afrikaans model, it's not easily replicable for other languages because the context is different. There was huge resources that were really poured to Afrikaans in terms of the intellectualization. But then they're saying those resources, as you have mentioned, are not there for African languages. So I think really the question is whether the Afrikaans model can really work for African languages.
You know, if I can respond, it's not like a model, it's an example. There's a difference between a model and an example. And they drew on the resources that they had. And it took a long time. You know, these Afrikaner groups were formed in 1910, 1912. So 46, it's 40 years, 35 years before you got the first textbook. So it took a long time there. It's not a miraculous thing. A lot of investment went in. But it's an example of what you can do. It's an example of destroying the hegemony, exclusive, suffocating hegemony of English, without being anti-English. In fact, we even use English. This conference is in English to promote multilingualism. It sounds like a paradox, but it's a practical way of going about things.
Okay. No, thanks very much. I think Mr. Mabizela is back now with us. I can go back to the question that was raised, Mr. Mabizela, regarding was whether what is the status of this framework? I think that was people wanted to know.
Thank you, Prof. Sorry about that. I don't know what.
That's okay. It's fine. Welcome back.
Yes. Yeah, thanks. I actually felt like listening more as the judge was responding to some of these questions, especially the legal matters. And it's nice to hear these matters from him. I got kind of I could not respond on the question of the definition. And I felt the judge has responded to that adequately, and maybe I would need to engage on that. Except to say, Prof, we in the process of development of the policy, there was a lot of consultation, and interestingly, one of the issues was around the definition. And so we arrived at the definition that we have now in the policy after consultation. So it's not the definition that the department came up with. And of course, we abide by that definition. And that's the definition we go by until at a point where then that the definition would then be revised. And so that's what we are having at the moment. Of course, the policy is going to be, we keep looking at the aspects of the policy that may at some point become irrelevant and so on. And when the time comes, then we can make the necessary revisions. And of course, even those revisions will be consulted upon with the sector. The legal status of the policy framework, like any other policy, the policy is the interpretation of what the law says. So, so in this case, for example, how we interpret the Constitution and how we interpret the Higher Education Act, as well as the other policies that have come before this, the white papers that were quoted extensively earlier on. So that is the legal nature of a policy. It doesn't mean, therefore, that there can't be any variations in the interpretation of it, as well as you have said it correctly, Prof. This is a policy framework, meaning, therefore, that the institutions are going to develop their policies in line with this policy framework. And what we are developing in terms of the implementation is the guidelines again, and the guidelines that will be, that the institution will align their strategies and plan in terms of the guidelines that we are developing. So maybe the question of legal, what's the legal standing of it? You know, some of these questions have got to be clearer than they are just asked, because we're then going to assume why the question has been asked. You know, if the institutions do not follow the policy, will they be held legally contravening the policy? No, not at all. But here is the framework that seeks to assist the institutions and also assist the development of our languages. So there is no, sometimes the legalities have got to be put behind and look at the bigger picture, what the policy is trying to achieve here. And of course, it doesn't mean, therefore, that, you know, the institutions can just do anything that they would want to, because we've got the Constitution, we've got the Higher Education Act. That's how I can respond to that one, Prof. Thanks.
Okay. Look, I'm seeing there are a few Afrikaans questions still there. You know, I mean, so maybe the distinction between Afrikaans and Western Cape. So they are saying, is it not possible for us to distinguish between Afrikaans, that is standard Afrikaans variety, that is used by the elite or the wealthy people, and from the Afrikaans that is spoken in Western Cape, for example? I think that is the point that, you know, Judge said, maybe we can say Afrikaans is an indigenous language of the Western Cape. Is there any need for distinction for that? I think from there we'll move to other questions other than Afrikaans. Yeah.
Is that to me, Prof? Or
no,
to anyone?
That I'm going back now to other.
Oh, okay.
I want us to exhaust the Afrikaans, then we move forward. Yeah. I don't know if it can still the judge will want to take that.
No, I think I'm glad the point was made. Afrikaans isn't just what's in the Woordeboek. I remember when I came back from exile, I went to Stellenbosch, and they were very proud. They were doing this huge dictionary, and they were up to M. And the last I heard is that's now 1990, and they're now up to, I think, T in the Woordeboek. That's like an official Afrikaans.
Yeah.
In the book. But the people who speak Afrikaans, you can't say bad Afrikaans. It's different Afrikaans.
Yeah.
And it's different in the Namakwa, it's different in the Western Cape, it's different working class. And that's part of the richness of Afrikaans. And it has a number of different forms in which it can appear. And that's part of its vitality. It's not an official language in the way maybe it was being defined as before. That's a source of strength, not of weakness.
Okay. No, thank you very much for that, Judge. Now, this one question I think is directed to Mr. Mabizela again. It's you mentioned about the national language plan that will be the plan, the language plan that will be developed by the department. So the question is, when is that going to be available?
Thanks, Prof.
A plan accompanying this framework. Is that
yes,
going to develop a plan for that?
We are actually in the process, Prof, and this colloquium is helping us a lot, actually. Yes. We are in the process, and of course we will consult with the sector, but the idea is to have it almost finalized by the end of the year. Now, this year, and then so that we can then work on the implementation with the start of 2022. One of the issues we have to be looking at, and I saw a question to that nature, is how we get some funds for the implementation of the policy. And so it's not so much necessarily about the changing of the funding formula or the funding framework of the system at this stage. Certainly not, that's not the plan. But the plan is that to have funding for the implementation of the policy. And so we therefore want to come to the sector once we have that in place, and to say to the sector, here is the guideline. And also we're putting together a committee that will assist us to do so. And as I had said, it's also about having all the other government departments, as well as the entities that have got something to do with the development of languages or language, African or indigenous languages, so that we don't work in silos. So there is that consultation as well that is taking place. And if I may, Chair, just on the last one about the DBE, the Department of Basic Education. Yes, absolutely correct that we're working in the higher education sector and not necessarily in the schooling or basic education. So in the development of this policy or this review, throughout it, we were having representation from the Department of Basic Education. Now, the plan doesn't end there. The plan is that we continue working with the Department of Basic Education because the development basically of individuals or the languages have got to take care of what is happening at basic education level. And also what DBE is doing in terms of developing these languages. But also remember that as higher education, we are also responsible for the development of teachers. And that is also where we come in the development of the languages, because these are the people, therefore, who then go to basic education and teach the languages in this case, and the languages that they will have picked up in higher education. So it's a cycle, really. It's not about you start with DBE and then come to higher education. It's a cycle. We've got higher education, we've got teachers who then go to DBE or basic education sector to teach these languages in particular in this case. Thanks.
Okay. No, thank you very much. Then the next question, I think that will also require your response, Mr. Mabizela. South Africa has numerous good policies, but there is a limited appetite for implementation. How do we ensure monitoring and reward progress in the implementation of this? So maybe that, yeah.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Prof. You know, the difference with this policy, and I said in the presentation, is that it's got a follow-up. It's not just a policy that is designed and then put there for everyone to follow that is impacted by it. It's got a follow-up, and this is the follow-up exactly in my previous answer, that we're doing a guideline, implementation guideline. And in that implementation, the institutions are required to account and support and submit annually progress reports on the implementation. And the purpose of that is also to make analysis of that so that we are able to see where are the problems with the implementation of the policy. And after a while, if the need is to revise the policy, then we do so. But more often, it will be about the implementation that we are looking at, tweaking it here and there, so that we make sure that there is delivery on the implementation of the policy. So that's the difference here. In the presentation, I was talking about the enablers, and that's exactly what we are trying to do so that we do things differently from how they were done in the past when the policy could not achieve what it was intended to. And so that's the difference with this one. Thanks, Chair.
Okay. No, thank you very much. Maybe Professor Mzanga, there is a question. I mean, you spoke much about what is happening in universities, practical implementation of multilingualism in teaching and learning. So there is a question here. What are the plans with regard to the development of teaching and learning materials in African languages to facilitate the implementation of the revised policy? I think something that also maybe Mr. Mabizela can comment on.
Okay, maybe let me start. Prof.
Okay.
You will see Dr. Tandeluwin tomorrow will be presenting on more on this implementation plan. But also, it's not just about the implementation plan, is what the department is already doing, because we're not waiting for the implementation of the policy. So there is work already in those who are familiar in the sector with what we call the University Capacity Development Program, which has got several other programs within it, where we are then coming up with ways to assist the institutions in the development broadly. I will put it broadly in the development of indigenous languages, but development of teachers in particular, and the language teachers in this case. And of course, universities, some of them have got the language units. And of course, those language units, that is where the development of languages has got to be taking place as languages as scientific language, if you like, as the language that has been used earlier on, but as languages that we would be able to use, or the terminology used as language of science in the implementation or development of the African languages. Thanks.
Okay. No, thank you very much for that. I can see we're left with 5 minutes now to wrap up. There are many questions that are in front of me here. And I will really suggest that some of these questions, maybe the speakers the people who pose them can engage with the speakers and find something. Maybe some of them will definitely be put together at the end and then be addressed. So there are quite a number of questions that are still here, and some of them really someone wanted to understand more information from Professor Mzanga, what their restudy of the implementation of multilingualism at Nelson Mandela, what was the outcome of that? So I don't know, maybe if you just 1 minute, you can answer that, Professor Mzanga.
Okay, thanks, Prof. Basically, this was not a study. It was just a matter of collecting information that will inform the development of the new revised language policy in our institution. So in terms of the students, I think that is where the interest is. We are still busy, looking into that information. But what was clear, if I may recall, was that, students were very clear that they would love to see multilingual assessment practices. Because as much as we're talking of teaching and learning, their main concern was around assessment. So this is what they put in there. And at the same time, I think for them, it was more on the, on the inclusion of multilingualism in the curriculum itself, because they were saying that it is one thing to be talking of multilingual practices and another if the conceptualization of our curriculum is not underpinned by multilingualism. So that is, I think those were the major things that they were talking to. And also there was a question of, students who are differently abled in terms of accessing tests and examination papers in Braille or oral communication. Yes. Thanks.
Okay. Now, thank you very much. I think we really need to give a hand of applause to all our speakers. They have really dealt with very, very difficult issues, and they've given us direction on how maybe addressing some of the questions that I think will open up a dialogue. So from the department government side, I think Mr. Mabizela really has given us the thinking behind the new language policy framework. And there are plans that they have in place that still need to be implemented. And Professor Mzanga has really given us some of the theoretical issues. Implementation of multilingualism raises a lot of the theoretical questions. She has addressed some of those questions, and she has also given an example of a practical example of what they are doing in their university, and also what COPAL is doing at the moment. So there's a lot that I think we'll get some of the reports during this conference. And of course, really we are grateful for the judge to give us the legal perspective, because I think the courts are also helping us to clarify some of the constitutional provisions, and also how we should go about, implementing our language policies. So I think the perspective that we get, the legal perspective, and of course, really my take home also is that why should you wait? I think we need to start flying our pilots. Let everyone do anything. So language policy can be seen as a text. This is what we're busy with now. But language policy can be also a practice. So I think where we seem to be lacking is the practice. There are some good practices there in different universities, but this has not yet been documented. There was a question asking whether COPAL plans to document some of these pilots that are running, and the Judge Albisaks also said, we think, let's have these pilots, let people start to do something, let people implement in a smaller scale so that we can scale up, and then we will be able to maybe have progress rather than waiting for a day when everything will be ready for us to implement. So thank you very much. I think we really learned a lot from these sessions, and we have got enough, to help us, enough fuel to go through these next 2 days that are coming. So thank you very much for this. You can go, I think, to the next sessions, and then people can go to the next sessions, and we are so grateful for this. Thank you very much. Okay.